Hello, hello, hello. Well, guys, the day has come and we are done with Lori Vallow Daybell. Today, she was charged with two consecutive life sentences. Of course, with possibility of parole after 25 calendar years. However, her life sentences not only were ordered to be run consecutive to each other, they were also to be run consecutive to her already her charges already in place, her five consecutive life sentences in Idaho. Now this, I was going to try to follow the same outline that I did with the Coburger thing and, go down and do everybody and who spoke and all that. And I very quickly, when this hearing started, realized that I was not going to be able to do that with this one. Because, okay, like even in Brian Coburger's hearing, you heard all of the families talk about how they were kind of one big family now and all that kind of stuff. Um, but they weren't. In this case, like this literally is one big family. These are people who previous to all of these deaths had spent a lot of time together. They knew each other. They had, spent holidays together, lifetimes together. Um, Literally, so this was literally one big family. And the difference being today, all of them were actually going to be able to get up there and give a victim's impact statement about all of it, not just these two. Because if you remember, when she got her charges in Idaho, we didn't have these charges yet. So, like when Miss Kay spoke in Idaho, she only got to speak about Tolly and JJ and Tammy. This time, this entire family was going to have the opportunity to finally get up there and speak about this entire horrific thing that happened, that was all put together and carried out by Lori Vallow Daybell, Chad Daybell, Alex Cox, and whoever, and who anybody else who conspired with them. So I just knew then, okay, I'm going to have to approach this one just a little bit differently than I did the other one. So, basically, it was very powerful. They did kind of split it up though. They started with Charles's family first, which they're all one family, but I guess, speaking of like Charles's, immediate family. However, the first person to give a victim's impact statement was Colby Ryan. And he gave his, of course, by phone, like I said, in one of my earlier videos. Colby's having a really hard time physically. His physical health has taken a hit. He's had 2 strokes in the last week due to a fungal infection that led to fungal meningitis. He's so young, and he's got this beautiful young family, but his health takes precedent over anything having to do with Lori any day of the week. But he did call in. He came in and he was the first one to give his statement. He gave his statement over the phone, and I can tell you that was a statement that he had been waiting and waiting and waiting to do for a very long time. Because, as I said, he now was able to actually approach her about the loss of his entire family at her hand, and he said that he also made sure that she knew, that Charles was his father. He talked about how, I lost my father, Charles Vallow, and my younger siblings, Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow. And all through his statement, he talked about losing his father. he considered Charles his father. And he was Colby was finally able to let her know, this is what I think of you. And he did that. He let her know exactly what he thought of her. And I think that she knows now that she can pretty much, not, she's not going, she shouldn't be thinking that Colby's going to be calling her anytime soon, put it that way. Next up, we had Larry Woodcock. Now, Larry has never spoken like this before. Miss Kay has, she's spoken publicly a lot, and she did the victim impact statement at the Idaho trials. Mr. Larry, though, hasn't spoken a lot. Mr. Larry, he had his day today, and boy, did he also let her know exactly where her place was, which was that she had none. Basically told her that she no longer even had a name. She would never be referred to by him by anything other than murder. So, yep. Mr. Larry got a lot off his chest. Now, there was also with Mr. Larry was one of Charles's sisters, Susan, and she got to make a little statement as well. We haven't heard from her. Then we had Miss Kay's, two of Miss Kay's children. The first was Todd. Now, Todd, in case you didn't know, I mean, most people know, but in case you don't know this, J.J. Vallow is actually the biological child of Todd and his longtime significant other. J.J. was born 10 weeks early, and he was born addicted to drugs. At that time, Todd and the mother were both going down a really hard path of drug addiction. And those two young people made the right decision to give up their rights as parents and allow. I think that Charles and Miss Kay and Mr. Larry had him at first, but they really quickly realized, they're a little bit older, than Charles and Lori, and they decided that they might be a little bit too old, to be taken on the newborn. And Charles had already told them, if y'all need somebody to adopt that baby, we will take him. And that's what happened. And so this Todd, not only is he speaking on the loss of his uncle, Charles, this is the first time that he's got to speak on the loss of his only son. So, yeah. And he did a really good job. Crescia, which is Miss Kate, one of Miss Kate's daughters, she also spoke, and she did a really good job. She also mentioned, I think that Megan, Connor, which is, Lori's cousin, she had a little bit that she spoke on that came from Megan too. So Megan was able to, have a little bit of time there too. After that, I believe it was Miss Kay. And Miss Kay did two things. She did her own statement, which was powerful. Miss Kay. Miss Kay is so articulate. I mean, she just knows. She's never at a loss for words. She never has to stutter for words. She knows exactly what she wants to say, and she knows exactly how she wants to say it, and she did that. Now, the next thing that happened is what absolutely this was something I've never seen happen in a courtroom. Miss Kay got done with her speech, and she left the podium, and you saw her go over to where she was sitting, and she opened her purse. At that point, Trina Kay told the judge, she said, I believe that she told Judge Boreski, I believe Miss Kay has a letter she wants to read you. And he said, okay. So Miss Kay gets back up to the podium and she opens up this letter. And the letter starts, Dear Judge Boreski, my name is Joshua James Vallow. Oh my goodness. Yes. She had written a letter on behalf of JJ because, that child suffered tremendously. He suffered tremendously after his father died and then was horrifically had his life taken by the person that he trusted, you know, the person that he called mom. And then to find out that, his mom also took the life of his dad. And, in the letter, Miss Kay talked about how, his dad made sure that he had, because he was autistic and he was special. And see, I have a child, I myself have a child on the spectrum. And so I can so appreciate all of this. um, talked about how his dad, did such a good job finding him the school that was it was for kids that had that stuff that were autistic just like he was. All of his friends there were autistic, and they all knew how to they knew how to play and how to speak to one another, and how his teachers knew how to teach him. Autistic children have a very hard time socially. That's one of their biggest problems is socially. Um, a lot of times they have a hard time around crowds. They might have a hard time around loud noises. But like my son, for instance, and my son is very high functioning, but one of the problems that he does suffer from is on the social side is it's very hard for him to be around people in crowds of people that he doesn't know. It's very hard for him to uh, meet and interact people and interact with people on his own. You know, he's it's hard for him, very hard for him to walk up to someone that he doesn't know and introduce himself. Um, but so I can appreciate all that. But he talked about how his dad, made sure he had what he called his best friend in the world, his service dog Bailey. And then also talked about how after his dad died, about how, his mom made him get rid of his best friend, service dog Bailey. And then his sister, who was his protector, you know, she took her away from him too. I mean, that letter, and she read it, like I said, she read the whole letter as being JJ, and it broke her down. It broke through. I think Miss Kay had kind of put up a wall. She had gotten tough about a lot of this stuff, but when she read that letter in court, it busted through that, and her emotions really, she got a lot of more emotions, to come, and she showed that. But the biggest thing and this literally, I mean, it was heartbreaking because I've never seen this happen in court. Judge Boreski, he's got a pretty good stone face. He's got the patience of Job, and he's got a really good stone face. Um, However, when Miss Kay was done reading that letter to him, um, his face had completely changed. Um, the look on his face, I mean, he did not, he went from being the Honorable Judge Justin Boreski to Justin Boreski, the father. He got emotional. I mean, you could see that on his face. I mean, that letter broke the judge, and I've never seen that happen. And it took him a little bit to get his stone face back. But after Miss Kay spoke, uh, another one of Charles's brothers, he got up there and did a statement. Um, And then we started with, those close to Brandon. Now, Brandon has, I think he's one of six, I believe. Um, One of his brothers spoke. Two of his sisters spoke. His mother spoke. And when Brandon did his, he also read a letter from his one of his other sisters. Um, and Brandon's wife spoke. His new wife, she came into this whole thing. I have to give her props, buddy. She's a tough lady and she's a strong lady because she literally stepped into a hornet's nest. Um, and she talked about how, Brandon just was having such a hard time, when she met him and was just terrified and, I mean, just a broken man, and she went through the whole thing, and she even talked about how when they got married, that their honeymoon, which was supposed to be this sacred time, this that you get to, it's that first time that you get to go somewhere actually as husband and wife, and just the two of you, and have fun, and just yeah, like I said, those first few, you know, days of being, husband and wife, and how special that is. And she said that, but instead of, instead of going on their honeymoon, that Brandon actually ended up. That was when they found the kids buried in Chad Daybell's yard. And of course, we know Tylee could not be, physically identified visually. Um, However, JJ could, and she talked about, how Brandon, called Miss Kate and Mr. Larry and offered to go identify JJ's remains for them because he knew that that would shatter them in a way that they may not be able to recover from at all. And he did that. Just a great lady. I mean, she was great. And she obviously loves Brandon's, children to death. And um, she's a strong person, strong lady. And he's lucky to have her. Of course, then came Brandon's statement. And of course, he was extremely emotional because uh, he talked about, having survivor's guilt because, why did he survive? But, why couldn't at least, the children have been spared, or something. But then he also had to deal with the fact of that literally someone that he was close to, someone, his family, someone that he was very close to, tried to take his life, and if they had succeeded, what would have happened to his children? Because I believe I believe that on one of her lists, Melanie's children were on one of her lists. So if they had succeeded with Brandon, more than likely his children would have been, you know, they would have been had their lives taken too. Um, but he talked about the fear after that. When before they had even in the first several months, um, him having the fear he had, and him having to move his children from his family, his brothers and his sisters and his parents. They all took turns helping him, and he would go stay at this one's house for a little while, and then he would leave that space and go over to this one's house and stay there for a little while, and they would help him with the children. And one of his sisters, that testified, she talked about how she took time off from her job, to come help him with the children, um, and how scary it was because they literally thought that someone was coming to they felt that their lives were in danger, and so they were in hiding. And then when Melanie Uh, and Alex Cox, who had, number one, he had his hand literally in all these deaths, all of them. He, along with Melanie, started going around to Brandon's friends, went to his parents' house looking for them. And that just shook him to a point to where, no, we have to go into hiding. And that was just, he talked about how horrible that was and how he felt like such a failure as a father, how his children couldn't be normal at this point in time. Because why? Because people that were close family, like I think that they said that Melanie called uh, Lori mom and call Charles dad, you know, and a very powerful statement. I mean, he was very emotional. But yeah, I talked about, how he had, survivor's guilt, and I can only imagine that. Um, but when he got done, of course, the judge said, okay, well, before we go any further, we need to give the court reporter a break. So there was a little break there. They came back, and then Trina Kay, of course, got up and spoke, and, of course, announced the charges that she was, requesting and all that. And then it was the defense's turn. Now, as with Koberger's case, the one good thing that I had to say about that fool that day was at least he had the sense just to stay seated and shut up. Stephen Stearns didn't have that good sense. Well, neither did Lori Daybell. Um, you know, even Koberger's attorneys, they were, when they were asked, no, we have nothing, Your Honor. Did he want to make a statement? Nope, he had no statement. Stephen Stearns' attorneys, no, we don't have anything. But when it came to Stephen, no, he wanted to talk. Why? Because him and Lori are very much alike. Very narcissistic, very sociopathic. Now he's not as on the, as far as the psychotic tendencies, he's not as quite as high on the list as she is, but still. But yeah, so here we go. So she starts her little thing. And this was just absolutely, it was a crap. It was a crap show. I want to say something else, but I'm not. It was a crap show. She literally started out basically being an advocate for prison reform, talking about how horrible that county jail was and how they didn't have proper, you know, how they couldn't get proper medical care and proper dental care and didn't have access to sunlight. And well, you know what? You're prisoners. You're criminals. Okay. If you want sunlight, how about this? Don't commit crimes. And they do. They get medical care. They get dental care. But guess what? These are, whereas if you are a person who actually follows the law and doesn't commit crimes and don't go to jail, as a free person, we have a multitude of doctors that if we're sick, we can choose from, right? Multitude of dentists, same thing, but here's the thing, when you become a prisoner, be lucky that there is an actual doctor that has a heart good enough to sign a contract with the county to be the doctor, for the jail. Same thing for the dentist, because not only does he have to come see y'all fools, he has a private practice somewhere that he also has to, people that are not criminals. And so just be happy that there are doctors and dentists out there that have the heart big enough to sign those contracts. Okay. But she, and went on to talk about how, in this jail and in this district in particular, how biased everything was. This judicial system here in Arizona just so biased. And, how the right to a speedy trial was never acknowledged, and how these people sit there for 10 years waiting on trials, and then she started getting personal with her own thing, and how basically everything that she ever put in a motion, okay, for why this, either for a new trial, motion for a new trial, or motion for, the existing, charges, whatever. All of those motions, everything that she put in there, she spoke out verbally today. Talked about how, she wasn't allowed to put on witnesses, and she wasn't allowed to do this, and she wasn't allowed to do that. No, ma'am, you were allowed to do all of that, all of it. Not only did you have, the first trial, you got a lot of leeway. You got a lot of, because you wanted to be your own representation. You also did not want to forego your right to a speedy trial. Okay. So, you didn't have quite as much time to prepare for that first trial. Okay. But when the second trial come up, you still have witnesses on your witness list that you didn't get subpoenaed and interviewed by the state that you had in the first trial. And you had, what, 8 weeks in between them? I mean, come on. Claim that she wasn't allowed to put witnesses. No, you had the ability to do that, but guess what? There are rules. There are deadlines. You did not meet any of them. And even though you still didn't meet any of them. Judge Boreski still told you that we could still, look at you putting witnesses on the stand. We would just have to address it in a witness by witness basis. You never brought any witnesses forward. That's your fault. Oh, but she said that, she wasn't allowed this, she wasn't allowed that, and the judge, everybody was biased against her, and how the jury was biased against her. And I mean, she just went on and on about that. Okay, the next thing that she talked about, she was an advocate for prison reform. Then she hit the whole story about how all of her rights have been violated. And then she went to God. She quoted a chapter, she quoted a Bible verse out of the book of Ephesians. And basically, the verse is talking about how, I don't know how I want to say this. I'll tell you what. I'm going to say it this time the way that she interpreted it, and then we'll come back on the backside and actually, look at it. Basically, she read the Bible verse and she said, God is training the prisoners in the prisons to be his warriors. And that one day, God is going to come back and he is going to bust down the walls of all those prisons, and all of those prisoners will be set free because they will be his warriors. That's what she said. Yeah. She said that God is training all of the prisoners to be his warriors, and that we're all going to see that one day God's going to come back and he's going to bust down the walls of those prisons, and we're going to see all of his, warriors free. Okay, Lori. She ended with that, and of course, when she got done, she slumped back in her little the little attitude that she has, and Judge Brusser looked at her and he said, "You got anything else?" Nope. In her little smart butt way that she does. So now it's Judge Boreski's turn. Boy. Number one, yeah, but he had her ticket punched from the beginning as well, though. First and foremost, he stood up for the judicial process. He solidified the fact that, 12 jurors of her peers are the ones that found her guilty. That no one associated with the court had anything to do with that. He didn't have anything to do with that. Trina K didn't have anything to do with that. Those 12 jurors made the decision that she was guilty on their own. Okay? Then, oh my goodness. Okay. He also took the opportunity at that time You know, to, because she was always talking about how, oh, the media, the YouTubers, everybody knows about my case. I can't get a trial. I can't get a good, not going. The jury's all going to be biased against me, and that's one of the things that she actually did say. When she was ranting, jury was biased, and all this because of everybody knows her. At this point, Judge Boreski took the opportunity to knock her down a notch. And he talked about, like I said, how it was a jury of 12 that found her guilty. And he said, as a matter of fact, you talked about how corrupt, our jurors were, and how, everybody was biased from the get go. He said, I can't tell you how many jurors during the jury, the process of picking the jury. He said, I can't tell you how many jurors we had to turn away for different reasons. Maybe it was that they had a problem talking about religious stuff, or they might have had a problem looking at crime scene photos. But he said, I can't tell you the number of jurors that we had to turn away during the process of picking the jury who literally had never heard your name. Ooh, I was like, whoa. I mean, basically, in other words, you want to sit there and you think that you're so famous and that everybody knows you and everybody's worried about you. Yeah, we literally had to turn people away. You want to think that it was hard for us to find a jury that wasn't biased? No, we actually had to turn people away that had never heard of you. So, but he did it in a way that just with that little tone of voice that was like, yeah, sit down, girl. You're not, you think she's kind of like Sarah Boone in that respect. She believed, they both believe that the whole world knows who they are. They're famous. He wanted to make sure that she knows that she ain't all that. Girl, you ain't all that. Girl, you ain't all that. Let's see. He then kind of went to the issue of, he talked about how a lot of people have asked, because one thing that she also complained about was having to be extradited from Idaho to Arizona, to face these charges. But he did address that next, but he kind of addressed it, and I've heard it too. There's a lot of people that have asked the question, why in the world did you spend the money extraditing her from Idaho to Arizona, and why are we spending all this money putting these trials on when she already has 5 life sentences? Well, I mean, the short answer for that is for Charles and Brandon. That's why. Charles and Brandon are also victims of her crimes. As victims of their crimes, they have the right to see that through, put her on the stand, to hold her accountable for her crimes. That's the short answer for that, because Charles and Brandon deserve that. Now, I'm going to say this. Now, Judge Boreski didn't say this. This is me talking now. On the backside of that, we also call these insurance sentences. And Judge Boreski took that into consideration because we already know that she does have an appellate attorney working on her appeals in the Idaho cases. Had they not taken her to trial for these charges and gotten these sentences, if something had happened in her Idaho cases and those verdicts had been overturned, there's the possibility that Lori Vallow Daybell would be free walking around the streets amongst the public again And you know what happens when she's out? More people would lose their lives. Okay, so these two, they're insurance sentences. Basically, if something like that were to happen, because Judge Boreski not only did he um, call them to be, served consecutively to each other, he also said that they were to be served consecutively with the 5 cases out of Idaho, which means that should something happen in her Idaho cases and those, for some reason, the verdicts get overturned, she would immediately now be transported to Arizona to start serving the life sentences consecutively for Charles and Brandon. So that's kind of, we call it, it's their insurance sentences, not, the first and foremost, the most important reason that it was done, well, because Charles and Brandon, that they deserved to get justice. But we also get these two, insurance sentences, and he set them up absolutely correctly, not only to run consecutively, but to also be run consecutively with her sentences in Idaho. So and that ensures that Lori will never walk the streets a free woman ever again. Now he went on to say, okay, can you hold on for just 1 second? I'll be right back. Okay, I need you to shut the door. All right, guys, sorry about that. I had people arrive back home. And I was like, no, be quiet. Shut the door. Okay, now, the next thing that Judge Boreski did, he addressed her and said, basically, he talked about her latent disrespect for humanity. That she didn't have, not just a singular victim. She had many victims. And with those many victims, there were twice as many, family members that they might not have had their lives taken, but the amount of fear that she instilled into them, and she did do that. These people were in fear of their lives too. Talked about, how just Charles and Brandon's, families, being scared for their lives. And talked about, he actually at that point acknowledged Brandon, and he said, you know, talked about how you suffer from survivor's guilt. He said, I could tell by looking at you before you ever said anything about it. He said, I could tell by looking at you that you suffer from survivor's guilt. And, he told him that he hoped that, with all of this, being done, that hopefully now he can really heal from that. Because he did. He suffered tremendous, and Judge Boreski, he told him, he said, I could tell it by looking at you. Even if you'd never said it, you can see it in your face, And, basically, told everybody, how sorry he was for the loss of Charles, and that from what he had seen and heard from everything, that Charles was a great man. Lori didn't want you to think he was a great man. Lori wanted you to think he was a horrible man. But the judge said, clearly he was a great man. And also, something that we didn't know until today, he said that, he was a great man, and he will always remember Charles, and he won't have any problem remembering Charles, because he and Charles, Judge Boreski and Charles, share the same birthday. So Judge Boreski said that from here on out, he would always remember Charles on his birthday as he was celebrating his own birthday. So that was pretty crazy. He also went on to say that, he had never had a defendant in his court that had spent, because we're going on to the, he's starting to talk about the penalties, the sentences, and all the things that he was taking into consideration when making these decisions. And one thing they said was that he'd never had a defendant in his court that had spent so much time planning her crimes. Never in his entire time as a judge had he ever had a defendant in his courtroom that had spent so much time planning the crimes. He also said that he really wonders if Alex actually died from the extra burden that Lori had placed upon him, making him, help her in the taking of all these lives, the taking of Charles's life first, the taking of Tylee's life, the taking of JJ's life, the taking of Tammy's life, and the 2 to 3 inches almost taking of Brandon's life. I mean, it was, we all know it was Alex that was, drove her Jeep down there, and yeah, he missed. All of those, it was brought out in the trial, how he was going to practice shooting ranges. Well, I'm pretty sure that, Tammy had the incident where she thought it was paintballs. Pretty sure that was Alex then too. So apparently whatever he did at the shooting ranges didn't help him any, because when it came down to it, he couldn't hit anybody. So thankfully. But yeah, he really did. He said that he really wondered if Alex had not died from the extra burden, from her that he held from her forcing him to participate in taking all these lives. Let's see. Oh, okay. Then the final thing that he did before he, announced the sentences. Remember that how I told you the first thing that Lori said, she quoted a verse out of the book of Ephesians in the Bible, and she said that how God was turning the prisoners into warriors. Judge Boreski corrected her on that, and he told her, he said, the Bible verse that you referred to in Ephesians, he said, that's not literal. He said that verse is referring to people. When you give over your heart to God, you become his warriors. Because before that, you're a prisoner of the bad. You're a prisoner of the dark. You're a prisoner of the devil. And so he said, that verse isn't meant literal. It's speaking about, how you become a warrior for God when you give your heart over to him. So, little Miss all-knowing religious woman, Judge Boreski was holding back. And he had a little bit of knowledge about the Bible himself, and he busted it right out on her, and she couldn't say a thing. Go, Judge Boreski. All right, so next we are down to the actual sentencing, which, before that, they had to talk about the aggravating factors, which she stipulated to. First she, at one point she wanted a trial, and then she didn't want a trial. She wanted to, when it came to the end of the trial, she wanted to stipulate, which means that you don't have an evidentiary hearing and all that. So she stipulated to all these. In other words, she said, yep, all that's, you're going to have evidence of all that. However, Judge Boreski did, he wanted to go on the record about one of the aggravating factors in particular that he could not take into consideration. And that was the aggravating factor about when committing this crime, they having already committed a felony within 10 years of that crime that they're being charged with at this point. The crime that this aggravating factor applies to. And he said that due to the way that that's written up, it states that the felonies have to occur before the actual crimes are committed. And since when she had Charles's, when Charles died, she had not. It has to be before the date of the actual instance, and so with Charles, she had not committed any felonies before that. And with Brandon, she had committed the felonies, with Charles, but at the time that she was charged with it, I think they didn't know about the charges with Charles or something. Or maybe, you know what? I kind of wonder about that because he didn't really, that's one thing that he didn't do. Or he may haven't, I just didn't hear it. But it did not apply in Charles's, especially in Charles's case, because the felonies had to be, I guess because she had not been charged with felonies before she caught the charge for Brandon. She had not been convicted of any felonies, and she hadn't been convicted of any felonies before that happened. So yeah, it applied to both of them. But anyway, I mean, basically, she stipulated to all of them. However, he was pretty smart in making sure that he put that on the record, that he did not take that particular aggravating factor into consideration because he couldn't. Because I guarantee you, she would make it an appellate issue. That would be an item on her little list for the appellate, process. So he was very smart in doing that. And then he went on to, go through, life, and with possibility of parole after 25 calendar years for Charles. Life with parole possible after 25 calendar years for Brandon. Of course, though, then he said these are to run consecutively, but not only are they to run consecutively to each other, they are also to run consecutively with the charges in Idaho. So she has 7 consecutive that have all consecutive, even though they're from different jurisdictions, 7 life sentences. Now, then he kind of went into restitution, but, kind of like with Koberger, how Judge Hippler had those fines that he had right there that day for him, and then the restitution would have to be figured out later. Same thing here. I believe her restitution that the judge was able to go ahead and sentence her with today was $267,000. Now, of course, there will be more than that once everybody gets all their tallies together, just like with, Brian Koberger. Now, the final thing, well, let me say this first. No, let me say this first. No, let me go. All right. After, doing all that, he also, of course, and you could tell that he absolutely hated doing this. You could tell on his face that he just hated having to go through all this. But, he has to inform her of her rights of an appeal, inform her of her appellate rights and when those deadlines are, if she so chooses to do that, which, in his mind, he's going, oh my gosh, she's going to do it. She's going to do it. Of course she's going to do it. She's Lori Daybell, but you could tell he was just hating life. But he also made sure that she knew. And because you have 7 consecutive life sentences, you get 0 days for credit for any that you've served. Now, the last thing that was on the docket was he also put into effect a lifetime injunction for Brandon, for Susan Vallow, for Kay Woodcock, and for Jerry Vallow. Those, basically what that means is that is a lifetime injunction, which means that for the rest of Brandon's life, for the rest of Susan's life, Kay's life, Jerry's life, she cannot in any way contact them, attempt to contact them, have anybody contact them for her, harass them in any way. She has an injunction. I wish that he would have maybe, without talking to Colby, I guess, that, because Brandon actually asked for the injunction. And I think that after, I think Brandon asked for the injunction during his impact statement. And they may have, kind of did a little side chat, when nobody was looking with Miss Kay and everybody. I'm sure they did. I know for a fact they did not mind it, even if they didn't have a side chat with Miss Kay. I know that none of them had a problem with having the injunction. I just wonder if, like, Colby, maybe, because he made it very clear in his impact statement that he wanted nothing more to do with her, that he wanted nothing more to do with her. She doesn't exist in his life, he made that very clear, don't expect him to be hearing from me. So and maybe that's something that, since I know Colby was watching all of this, maybe if he would like to have such an injunction, he can let the judge know, and, she'll be informed of that as well. Because I can totally, if I were Colby, I would want it, But yeah, that was the end of it. So basically, she can't, harass anybody, nothing. And he also made sure that she understood that if indeed down the road somehow she were to somehow make any profit from the telling of her story by way of a book or a documentary or anything like that, any monies made from that would be put into go towards the restitution for the victims' families. And he explained to her I think they have like a certain funds that you have to donate monies into when you're coming into, I guess, when you're starting your sentence or whatever. But yeah, and that was it. It was very, very emotional. And it was, this was just a totally different thing. I mean, because this was one big family. These are people, Brandon already knew, Kay and Larry. They had already, like, all of these people, even though they came from two sides of the family, you have Lori's side of the family and Charles' side of the family. Even though that was the case, these people were close. I mean, they were close. They were all close together. And so this was one big family, and the last time that Lori, was in court, getting sentenced, the only thing that they could speak on was, Tally and JJ and Tammy Daybell. But this time, I mean, this was, paramount for this family, because now they were finally able to get everything out about all of the loved ones, because they could speak on everybody finally, because, like I said, Brandon talked about how close he was to Charles and how he was mourning him. I mean, this is somebody that his wife at the time, her niece, Melanie Pulowski, she called Lori mom and Charles dad. and so they were extremely close with them. And, by way of that, that's how Brandon was also, pretty close with, Larry and Kay Woodcock, Larry and Kay being the biological grandparents of little JJ, as well as being Charles's sister and brother-in-law. And so, like, this was one big family. I mean, you kind of had, yeah, you had your two different segments, but at the end of the day, it really is one big family. In the Koberger trial, they all kind of talked about how they were one big family now, but that was kind of different. It was more so, they're kind of in a brotherhood together, that because they are, suffering from something that, most people never have to, suffer through. And, so it was a little bit, yeah, they're close with each other and one big family for that particular trauma. But this literally is one big family. And it was powerful. And like I said, I have never seen a judge lose his composure on the stand. I mean, Judge Boreski, this whole time, we always are talking about stone face. He's got stone face, and, he's got the patience of Job and a stone face. And I mean, literally, he looked like a different person. When she started reading that letter, he had his stone face on. When she was done with that letter, he looked like a different person. Like I said, when she started the letter, he was the Honorable Judge Justin Boreski. By the time she was done with that letter, he was just Justin Boreski, father. And he was, yes, I mean, you could tell he was emotionally upset. And I've never seen that happen before. So kudos, Kay, and thank you, Kay, for giving little JJ a voice, because, he needed it. All right, guys. I tell you what, I'm going to take a break here. But like I said in my video last night, I have several things that I've got to get on here to do, because, man, I mean, there's stuff going on in the world right now that is just, it's absolutely nuts. I mean, we all know that there's crazy stuff going on in the world all the time, but there are certain things right now that we're just having a whole lot of. And like I said, I've got several stories to do videos on. And the thing is, they're all regarding the same general subject. Different stories, different people, different places, same general subject, all in a 2-week time period. So I think I'm probably going to start those, and I'm going to make those like a series. I'm going to make those series because, I mean, it's domestic violence related, and actually, bordering on family, annihilation. So, yeah, I've got several things. And I also have a story about another, children. We've got to protect these kids. So, yeah, I think I'm going to do a series with my domestic violence things. And then I've got the other one. So I'm going to get off here for now so I can rest my voice and have some lunch and go talk to my boys that just got back from spending my youngest, his birthday. He turned 14 on Tuesday and got birthday money. And so his older brother took him to GameStop, which is a video game store, to spend his money. So I'm going to go get me something to drink and something to eat, and we'll talk to them and see what all they got. And I will see you guys later. And just remember, as always, have fun, be safe, and always know that you're loved. Love you guys. Bye.